Eric had been a worrywart his entire life.
He was laying there, rolling through everything, overthinking.
He didn't have the emotional literacy to be able to be like, "Oh yeah, these are anxious behaviors," or "I'm feeling anxious."
All of a sudden, he was acting very differently, and we had no idea why.
He used to say to me all the time, like, "I think you saved my life. I think I would not be here if it wasn't for us being together." I was just like so taken aback by the deep level of pain that he was experiencing.
That year of where these patterns were getting significantly worse, um, we still didn't really know what the problem was, but you could tell, like, it felt like he was hiding something.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Before we get started, we just want to say thank you to all those of you who have been sharing positive feedback and who have been sharing your own experiences, and how our podcast has been helping you in your own personal lives, maybe with dealing with your own things or even just helping others and your friends, family, whatever, with what they're dealing with. It's been really cool to see some of the feedback and hear it. If you are more interested, we did make a post on our social media with some of that feedback if you'd like to read through it. But
Yeah. It's been super great just to see like the various ways that what we're talking about impacts people, because not everyone has gone through the death of somebody or loss or anything, even close to what we've gone through. But it's nice to hear that like the way that we're sharing our story is relatable to people regardless of their situation, because I think there's some universal things that we talk about with regards to just how we're feeling or how we were feeling, how we have been dealing with things, that kind of, you know, uh resonates with people um regardless of the specific circumstance. So that's been like super cool.
yeah, and also just it's been very enlightening, or very encouraging, I should say, for us to continue as well, because um, it makes us both feel like we're actually having a positive impact, and it's been very cool to hear how our story is helping other people. So keep it up, keep sharing that stuff with us. Feel free to comment or leave a review with that as well if you're not afraid to be more public with it. Um,
Yeah.
but we really appreciate it. It's really cool to hear everybody else's
It's
experiences.
it's just good to know because I mean, I think, this has been something that you and I have wanted to do for a few years now. It's been a passion project of ours, and really we have some, you know, ultimate messages and things that we feel are impactful from our perspective. And it's nice to hear that people are getting value out of it, because uh there's a lot of work that goes into putting a podcast together, and like I don't know that you necessarily realize like how many moving parts there are to it. And obviously like we're self-producing this. It's not like we have like somebody doing this podcast for us and we just show up as talent, which I would love, by the way, just to show up and be the talent. But
I think this is the busiest I've ever been in my entire life. The last couple of months doing this.
yeah. And it's important for us that the quality is good. And so to know that people are noticing that they're, appreciating and can tell that we've put a lot of effort into this. And on top of the fact that, like, we're really just being ourselves. Like, the people who know us really well are used to us being this way, but we're very comfortable talking about some of these subjects. And the fact that we now have the ability in this day and age to do it in such a public way, but still really connect to people, you guys, like in a more intimate way. It really is just it's a super cool like thing to be able to do.
Well, and also hearing from people that, like, maybe that I'm not so close to being very positive about it and like coming up to me and being like, "Oh, hey, I listened to your podcast and it's really good." And that stuff is very cool to hear because again, it's very encouraging. Having put in a lot of effort to this stuff, knowing that even people that I'm not super close to are listening and resonating with it.
Yeah, it's been awesome. It's been great to get that feedback. So, what are we diving into? I mean, I know we kind of left things in our last episode. We talked a lot about who Eric was and everything that we loved about him and what type of person he was. So, uh, what's what's next? Like, what happened? How do we continue that conversation to sort of tell the progression of things that happened leading up to his death?
Well, I think kind of at this point, about a year before he died, he really started. Um, I would say demonstrating his struggles with more the mental health side of things. He had a few other things going on as well that like uh, kind of throughout the entirety of my life, or at least knowing him, um, that popped up here and there. Namely, I would say one of the biggest issues that kind of probably contributed to the way things went down is he had this he had like insomnia, like a sleep issue. And for a very long time, we didn't really know what it was. But I think we can kind of start off with talking about that and like our
Yeah.
experiences with that.
I
Um,
think the first thing to note is that as we talked about and touched on a little bit in the last episode is your dad, to us it was very clear that he struggled with anxiety, and he has, I think, pretty much the entire time I know him or have known him. And the interesting thing about the anxiety is that I truly, again, hindsight 2020, looking back at it, when someone like that dies and it's out of the blue and, you know, tragic and sudden, um, there's really like you just want as many answers to things as possible to try to piece together like how did it get to like how did this happen, right? Because I will say that his death was accidental, but it could have been prevented, I think, potentially. You just don't know for sure. But I think that, like, when you're trying to figure out the answers, and especially at this particular time, in the process after losing him, is we still didn't have answers. Like, we didn't have answers. So you're trying to figure out, and you start to become kind of a detective. And I think that sometimes people get dismissive about the need for answers, like, maybe you don't wanna know that stuff, maybe it's too hard to go deep into that, and, I mean, maybe it is for some people, but I know for me, and even for you, like, there was a driving force to need to understand what happened,
well,
to
because
be able to really.
I think the important thing for us too is everything went downhill so fast um, with him, and then all of a sudden it was over, and it was like, uh, you know,
What happened?
yeah,
Like.
we were it was a huge whirlwind for us, the whole process, and then we were left to pick up the pieces, and obviously hindsight is 2020, but like, but we didn't know exactly what happened, and then yeah, I think there are a lot of people who think that looking for answers is going to be too painful, and so they just let it go, and that's fine for some people, but for us, it was it was too confusing and too painful to not know. Like,
Yeah.
and then especially because everyone else was also looking for answers, and it was such
Yeah,
a
and
mystery at the time.
people don't just f like, it's not a common thing for a 38-year-old person to just die in a hotel room alone, like,
Well,
that
and not
just
and not from
um
something easily explainable like a heart attack, or
exactly.
it was such a mystery, like we've talked about, kind of extensively. So getting back into kind of the progression of things.
So let's go back to the anxiety piece. the inside running joke in our family, and I'm talking our family, like immediate family, but then also like Eric's family, was that Eric had been a worrywart his entire life. Like
Mhm.
that was a term that was often thrown around with your dad.
And even
You
even thrown
know,
around with me because I kind of took after
you
him
kind of
in
have
that
taken
in a
on
little
some of
ways.
those. Yeah. And so, and I think that's important to note because obviously before his death, we found out he was struggling with pretty bad anxiety. Like, and we always saw it. Like, from the beginning, when I was dating him, all of that things, I saw that he was struggling with anxiety. I recognized it because I grew up in a household where there were a lot of mental health issues, a lot of, um, there were substance use issues, when I got a little bit older and my siblings were a little bit older, there were, you know, bipolar, severe depression, suicidal ideation, like various things where I had a lot of exposure to mental health and the struggles that come with it. And so, but on the flip side, your dad didn't not necessarily have a lot of exposure to that. But he was a person that constantly worried. And, again, from a very young age, his mom was like, yeah, he's my little worry wart. Um, and I think that, like, throughout the years, even from when I first was together with him all the way until he wasn't here anymore, we both had noticed over time, we recognized when he was super anxious. There were physical tells that he had that indicated he was anxious. There was a palpable
He was a huge
energy.
fidgeter for one thing. That was one thing that I remember always noticing is he
He
was
was
always
what?
a fidgeter.
Oh, fidgeter. Yeah,
Yeah,
he
so
fidgeted a
he
ton.
he would bounce his leg no matter anytime he was sitting. He would play with like bed sheets or like pillowcase or he would play with his pant leg. Um,
It's
you know,
almost like a self-soothing mechanism.
right. I mean, a lot of fidgeting is that it's some sort of like self
Yeah.
soothing, mind calming type thing. But it was constant for him. I don't think thinking back to it, I don't think he was ever not fidgeting with
No.
something. You know.
Yeah. And I think that's important because again, we learn later that he had severe social anxiety. But even though I recognized it and even sometimes you recognized it, again, we've mentioned he's so extremely stubborn, so stubborn, and also kind of grew up with this mentality that like, back in that day, if you think about when we were younger, era, early 20s was like late 90s, early 2000s. And so there still was a lot of stigma around mental health, a lot of misunderstanding around depression, anxiety, all of those things. And so there was this pervasive attitude in general that like it's all in your head. It's kind of just baloney, like it's not real. So you combine that mentality of him thinking that way with the fact that like this has literally been like embedded in his personality since he was a very young child. I don't even like he just really did not correlate his fidgets and his tells and like when we could tell us anxious with actually being anxious. He didn't have the emotional literacy to be able to be like, "Oh yeah, these are anxious behaviors," or "I'm feeling anxious," to communicate that, and it just was his normal. So like he
Yeah,
didn't see it as anything different.
yeah. I was gonna say it was uh, it was such a normal thing for him to be feeling that way all the time that like when you would point it out he'd just be like, what are you talking about? You could feel his anxiety. I think I said this in the last episode, but you could feel his anxiety from across the room, and you'd be like, "Wait, what, what's on your mind? Why are you so anxious?" And he'd get defensive, almost like, I'm what are you
He
talking
gets
about? Like, I'm
so upset about it.
well, and I think he also kind of had this mindset. I think on some level of like the man up mindset where especially with mental health, it's like you just man up and you deal with it. And mental health, is not that huge of a deal. It's all in your head. You can fix it on your own. You just got to man up and get over it, and do what you have to do. And that's obviously not the case. I mean, both clinically and also just like, I think now society has started to come around on that idea that you can't just get when you have mental health issues, even something that seems more simple like anxiety or depression, you can't just get over it. But that was kind of his mindset, is that he could just fix it himself, that he would just get over it, or that that he just had to do what he had to do, and he was very
I
stubborn
think
about
also
that.
yeah, I think it's important to note too that like he didn't grow, we and I when I say we, I was probably more the driving force in this around really focusing on teaching you emotional literacy and
Emotional
awareness
intelligence.
around mental health. Well, and just being able to like understand what feelings are what, right? Like being able to label them. Um because of my past experience with my upbringing. So then you reverse that on his side, his upbringing, there wasn't a comfort of openly talking about feelings. Um, and I adore our family. Like the one thing that I've been so appreciative and thankful for is the fact that like they're my family, your dad's family. Like that hasn't changed since he passed away.
Yeah, you
And
still have a very close relationship with a lot of them.
given the challenges that I have with my own family of origin relationships and the toxicity that's there, that family piece is so incredibly important for me. And so um they are like the best people. And at the same time, talking about how they felt, like they were not like super touchy feely, you know, openly emotional. And it's not that they didn't feel emotions, but it was just they had a tendency a lot of times to just sort of be like, like, I'm fine. And we stuff it down and we don't really talk about it. And so you got to remember your dad grew up in that environment as well. So, you know, he did have that habit of sort of dismissing how he was feeling, probably not knowing how to connect to and relate the fact that he was feeling anxious, and then also having his own biases and stigmas against mental health as a male who grows up in our culture.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, he put a lot of pressure on himself, I think, to be the man of the house, to provide, to that you know and there's nothing wrong with that, but I think he put it on himself so much that he was embarrassed or didn't want to disappoint us, when he did have faults or when he did have shortcomings, or maybe he thought that admitting, that he had these issues, or confronting it would mean that he was weak in some way. And I think that that kind of mentality pervaded his mind, into being stubborn about it and not really allowing anyone to in on his feelings, or
Yeah.
to.
And I'm sure, like everyone, it's not comfortable to be vulnerable like that. To open yourself up to that. And again, you got to think about initially, the time period that we lived in. We're in a better space where there's more understanding of mental health today. There's still a lot of work to do around building awareness, but especially in that time frame, there still was a lot of very open bias and stigma against depression, anxiety, etc. And your dad had that that bias and stigma for himself as well.
And I think even in today's society, I mean, especially working in the ER, we're kind of frontline workers on the mental health crisis that's been happening over the last, I would say, since COVID. It's gotten exponentially worse, but like,
Oh,
and
100%.
I think everybody's begun to realize how big of a problem it is, when you do have mental health issues and how common it has become to, face things like anxiety and depression, and those things, for many people, become killers. Like, they are an illness, just like any other physical ailment. uh they can kill you, um in many different ways.
Yeah, I think that's part of why we really wanna take you through this story, because I think that it was very easy to miss, obviously, like, what was going on with him, which is what we'll get into, even despite being a household who that was what I would say typically more aware of mental health than probably the average household at that particular time.
Well, and
Um, I
and being as close as we were and as open with each other as we typically were, um, you know, and we knew he had these problems, but I don't think either of us really knew to what extent they were. For he was very good at hiding his emotions on that front. Um, when he was.
and and let's not forget, like, he wasn't, like, disconnected or hiding. He was like, in terms of our relationship together, and even with you, like, he was vulnerable. He would talk about how he felt around other things. We all had really good communication, and his and I's relationship was really close and connected emotionally, except for when it came to discussion of anything related to mental health. So
It was like negative, any negative feelings that he had, about himself or his life, or his anxieties
he
about
just
where things were going. He
box.
would
He
just
put it
yeah,
in
he
a
would
box.
shut it down. Um,
Yep.
so he had that kind of predisposition already, and as I
Mhm.
kind of mentioned earlier, we can get into the sleep issues that he had. So when he
Yeah.
was so prior to his death, he actually finally did do a sleep study, and he fought us on this for a very, very long time. But
Yeah,
what
I
were
mean,
what were the results of that again?
well, let's back up a little bit too. So, from the time I met him, he very periodically would have these episodes, where it seemed like he all of a sudden would be it would like he was under the influence of something. Like, he would get stumbly, and he would, slur his words and be kind of like, not coordinated, um and really just like you'd be like, you need to go to sleep or something. Like, he it almost honestly, like, and it wasn't super bad when we first got married. It just happened once in a great blue moon. But it, kind of progressively, sort of very slowly, got more frequent. And the best way I can explain it is, like, he'd be fine one minute, and then it seemed like he was high as a kite, like, the next minute. And I was really paying attention, because, again, like, the thing about Eric and his family, uh as a whole, is that they just happen to be of the genetics that have a really high tolerance to alcohol. And sometimes I would notice that, like, if he'd had a drink or two, that would happen, but it was really hard for me to figure out, like, what was actually going on, if it was related to the alcohol or not related to alcohol, because it would happen where he was only drinking, like, 1 or 2 beverages, which, from someone who has an extremely high tolerance, wasn't something that should make him seem like he's extremely intoxicated. And then I think the other thing that's important to know is I was not a naive person. I was very well aware of the fact that people hide things, you know, if they're using substances outside of that happens. Um, but, like, we shared all of our finances, like, and I was the person that managed our finances, you know, we were open with each other. I like it there was never a thing of being secretive or weird with like passwords or things like that. Like, I mean, I just if I needed to get in his computer, I'd go in his computer. If he needed to get in, if his phone was there and I like didn't have my phone, I'd be like, "Hey, let me use your phone." I mean, like that was the level of trust that we had with each other. So like it's not that it didn't cross my mind at times when that happened like is there something else going on there? But there was no evidence of that and it absolutely wasn't. And then the thing that really started to make it worse was that it was starting to happen with no alcohol at all. So like I kind of chalked it up to like, oh, he must just be overtired and then if he has like a beer or two, that seemed to
Makes it
be like
worse.
when it would happen. So like he just needs to go to bed.
And I didn't really notice his episodes uh, until I would say I was more of a teenager. But I always remember he would. Well, first of all, kind of the thing that pointed us to really realizing that it was a sleep issue more than anything was there was one night I must have been 10, 11 years old or something like that, and we
Yeah,
had a we
you
had
probably were closer to 12 cuz we
yeah.
moved not too long after that.
I remember we had a bunch of people over. We were all hanging out. Nobody was drinking or anything like that. And
There
I
wasn't a
remember,
bunch. It was actually just our one good friend that lived close to us and the kids.
oh yeah, yeah. Well, I mean that's still like four or five people, four people. Um, but I remember and when he had these episodes, and when you say that he was like high, or he would act like he was high or intoxicated, it was literally he would start slurring his words, he would start stumbling around, he would oftentimes get like extra affectionate, or just kind of like unusual behavior.
Or uh, extra affectionate or the flip side would be he'd get irritable and he would like try to start arguments or things like that. So it was like one or the other.
Yeah.
And
And on this night, I remember he it was almost like a flip of a switch. We knew he hadn't been
he
drinking.
wasn't drinking at
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
And
We were all
like
together. Like we knew he hadn't had
yeah,
anything to drink. We knew he hadn't had anything else. And he, all of a sudden he was talking weird, like slurring his words. And he got up to go to the bathroom, and he kind of like stumbled down the hallway. And he was just acting differently out of nowhere. And all of us noticed it, including, your friends who were there.
our friends, yeah.
Um, and I remember you made him go to the hospital because you're like, "Did you take anything? Did you drink anything?" And he was like, "No." And mind you, I was 12. I had no idea what was going on, but I remember sitting in the hospital and, doing all those tests, and
Well,
it's kind
and
of
let me back up too is that I had been trying to explain to him up to that point that this stuff was happening and he was just like, "Nope. Like you're just,
you're making it
making
up.
it an issue. It's not a thing." And it was something that was really frustrating for me. And when that happened and it was like literally he hadn't had a beer or any sort of cocktail at all, in the flip of a switch, he was sitting next to me. One minute he was fine, next minute you would have thought that he was high as a kite or was extremely intoxicated. And like you said, our good friend noticed that and, was like, "What is going on?" And I'm just like, "Something is not right, and this is scary." And like, he was stumbling around and it was a fight to get him to go to the ER. So again, stubborn man, does not want to go to the doctor, doesn't think that what we're seeing in his behavior is actually happening. So he thinks that he's fine and we're just exaggerating or
Blowing it out of
making it a big deal.
proportion. Yeah.
And so it was an extreme fight to get him to go to the ER. But somehow I was able to convince him to go. And even when we got to the ER, now I was going to, I was 99% confident that he had not ingested anything or drank anything or, you know, I I was that was part of what was so concerning for me. And
It's like,
but
is he having a stroke?
right, but I wasn't naive enough at that point to think that he couldn't have been having those things going on. I went into that doctor's visit into the ER being like, maybe he is doing something and I just am not aware of it, because you'd be naive to think that someone couldn't hide that from you, right?
Well,
And
and even and now, like looking back, right? From a medical perspective, it essentially was he had an altered mental status, and that can, as a nurse, that can mean a million different things. That can mean they ingested
mhm,
something, or they have some sort of toxic chemical in their system, or they're having a stroke, or they're having micro seizures, or like there's a million different things that can cause that sort of altered mental status, and some of them are emergencies. And this was something that, especially in this moment when all of us had witnessed his sudden change in behavior, was very,
mhm.
very concerning, because
It
it was like
was.
all of a sudden he was acting very differently, and we had no idea why, and he had no idea why, and he didn't even think it was happening, which is another thing that's concerning.
Right. And I think, and then when we got to the hospital and explained what was going on, even the doctors and the nurses were like, "Are you sure you didn't drink anything? Are you sure you didn't take anything?" Like, again, in the ER, just to make it clear for people and the hospital in general, we don't have judgment around what you're taking, not taking, how much substance you have on board.
We're not the
If
cops.
you're we're not the and you're not yes, we're not calling the police. You're not going to get in trouble. There's a protection in the law that prevents us from being able to do that in the first place, unless there's some sort of harm or crime or, whatever. But like, it's almost a non it's such a rare circumstance where we would have to contact the police for anything. So when you come to the ER, we often get a lot of people who might have taken substances or have drank excessively, and their thought process is, I'm going to just deny that I did, or I'm going to downplay what I took, because there's fear of judgment, there's fear of stigma, there's fear of getting in trouble. And I think it's important to clarify, just now that we actually are healthcare providers that work in the ER, there is no judgment. You aren't gonna get in trouble. We, by law, cannot, tell the police that you're about your medical history.
But
We need to know
it's
to
our
be
job
able.
to rule out everything, and we have to know
Mhm.
those things in order to do our job effectively. Because especially in the emergency room, doctors and nurses, you're investigators, and you have to. There's a million different things that something like that could be, and you have
Right.
to rule everything out. It's not trying to figure out what it is; you're trying to figure out what it is at most of the time.
Yeah. And unfortunately, this still happens, and this is what happened, I think, when we went to the ER with your dad that time, is that the stigma still exist in people's heads, and the judgment. And as much as, we should not be making judgments in that way in our profession, it does still happen. And so, you know, that's exactly what happened when we brought Eric to the ER this particular time. Is they took one look at him stumbling, slurring, all this stuff, and they didn't believe. They were just like, "Dude, you had like just tell us they were like, "You had to have taken something." They're talking to me and sort of like, "Oh my goodness, you gotta be like the stupidest person ever. Like, clearly he's using something." And I kept saying, like, "I'm not naive. I had family members who were dealing with this issue. So like, I'm not naive. I'm not saying that it couldn't be possible, but I'm pretty confident that there is nothing in his system that is causing this." And
They
they
did blood
did,
work
you
and
know,
urine tests,
blood
and
work, and it was all negative. There was nothing in there. So, validating, on one hand. And then what the ER doctor said that was made so much sense is, he said, I think he was asking him about his sleep patterns. And we had started to talk about again, as long as I've known Eric, he really has struggled with sleep. And I have always noticed it to correlate with his anxiety. It was almost like he couldn't shut his brain off, to the point that, like, there were times that I would wake up in the middle of the night because I could sense his brain just going. And, like, I mean, I'm fairly sensitive to that as it is, but, like, there's times where I just would be like, "What is going on?" Because I could feel, like, his anxiety in his brain just nonstop
He was laying there rolling through everything, overthinking.
over and over and over again. And over the years, even prior to, like, recognizing or finding out that he had insomnia and all of that, like, I was constantly trying to get him to see a doctor, to even just try and, try some sort of anti-anxiety type medication, because, I also at certain points of my time dealt with really bad panic attacks and some anxiety, and had taken some medications off and on, and realized the benefit of them and, like, the fact that they did help. But again, stubborn man to a T, doesn't want that label and stigma and doesn't think that he needs it. And so there's times that, you know, when they said, like, so basically what the ER doctor said is that based on his symptoms, they were pretty confident that he had sleep deprivation. So, and like severe sleep deprivation. And they're basically like, it's related to insomnia. We really highly recommend you get a sleep study, because when you have sleep deprivation, it literally puts you into a state of your body being almost in a state of intoxication, which is why it's super dangerous for people to drive when
I was
they're
going to bring that up.
deprived of sleep.
They say that sleep deprivation is actually much more dangerous than driving intoxicated,
Mhm.
because especially if you're
Absolutely.
on the verge of falling asleep, first of all, most of the time when you're sleep deprived, you can very easily fall asleep at the wheel, but also, like, you do sometimes act like you're intoxicated when you're very tired.
Mhm. So, when the doctor said that, it was validating for me, because I was like, "Okay, I'm not, like, just making this up in my head. There's a reason that he's behaving this way." And then, again, my brain is like,
And he's
"Okay,
not
we just get a
hiding
sleep
anything from
study."
us either.
Right. "We just get a sleep study, let's figure it out." Well, of course, it's your dad, so you think a sleep study happened. And this was probably in, like, 2012, and let's just be clear that, like, I had been on him for years before that, because I knew something was wrong. Like, "We need to go to the doctor. You need to get this checked out. Like, this is not normal. This is what's happening." And he would just kinda do the whole, you know,
It's not that big of
"It's
a
fine.
deal.
It,"
You're blowing it out of
what,
proportion.
yep. And so it was validating to have that. But do you think that we had any luck at all getting him to decide to go to the doctor and do a sleep study? Absolutely not.
Well, like I said, it wasn't until only a few months before he died that he finally went and got a sleep study, and
And that was such a fight. It was so
it still was a
hard
fight.
to get him to that point. And but it had progressively gotten worse over the years, and it got really bad the summer before he died.
Well, like I
And
said, that was the first time I really noticed it was that night when we took him to the emergency room. And then I
mhm,
remember, like, I don't think I really noticed it much after that until we had moved, and we moved down, a couple hours away. And um, I remember nights when he would come downstairs, and he would act like that. And it got to the point, especially a year and a half before he died, these um, episodes would happen so frequently that you and I just got to a point where we'd be like, "You're tired, go to bed," because because he would suddenly start slurring his words and being, acting intoxicated. And like you said, sometimes he'd get irritable and start, almost picking fights. Or on the flip side, he'd get extra affectionate and, like, in a way, it was nice and
it's like that
endearing
annoying
sometimes.
level.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was nice and endearing, but then sometimes it's like if you're busy and you're doing something and he it basically like you turn into a dog who just wouldn't let up on getting attention, you know? Like
Yeah.
like when a dog comes up to you and just like has to be on your lap and they won't accept anything otherwise. That's the level
Yeah.
of like attention seeking that he would be like in that state sometimes. And so I
And
remember he
very
would
affectionate and needed a
yeah,
lot of attention and
yeah, and
yeah.
but he would do that all while slurring his words and stumbling around. And you and I both got very attuned to that episode, and so you and I would
Mhm.
got to a point where we wouldn't put up with it anymore, and we would just be like, "You're tired, go to bed. You need to go to sleep."
And
And
yeah, literally they're
eventually he got to the point where he would just listen to us, and he'd be like, "Okay," and then he would go to sleep.
yeah. And I mean, it got to a point where I literally would just be like, because he would also get distracted. It's like he'd be like, "Okay, I should go to bed," and then
And then
he'd
he'd wander
get
around the
distracted
house
with
for
something
30 minutes, going and doing random stuff.
and probably being anxious and whatever. So there'd be times where I literally would be like grabbing him and being like, "You need to go to bed." And this is the other thing that was really interesting is that there were times, so like when he did actually fall asleep, remember at some point earlier in the episodes, we talked about how we used to joke that if we ever had a fire or something of that nature, like Eric was
Yeah,
out
once he
because
was asleep, he was out.
he slept so hard to the point that if you tried to wake him up in that type of sleep, it's like when he finally would go into that deep, like REM sleep, he would wake up and like be super confused and have no idea what was going
Oh yeah.
on.
I
If he
remember
got
I
woken
remember
up out
like
of a dead sleep.
full on jumping on him at times and he still wouldn't wake up, trying to like, "Hey, you need to get up and do
Hmm.
something or whatever." Like he'd go take a nap and you could not wake him from that nap.
No.
I'd
And
be
so
physically shaking him like, "Hey, I need you for something." And he would be like, he would not wake up whatsoever.
yeah. And I think so we finally got him to do the sleep study, and there was part of me that thought maybe he had sleep apnea because there were times that he would be snoring and sort of like
Well, he was a
stop
huge
breathing.
snorer. He snored really loud a lot
Right.
of times, and that was another issue that we had, is we would always hit him if he was snoring.
And when he would sleep next to me, I'm fine. Like if I fall asleep first, I don't have an issue. It doesn't wake me up. I'm a hard sleeper as well. But if I was like not falling asleep first and he was snoring, then it was annoying. And then it also, I would notice like the pauses in his breathing, which is very common with sleep apnea. So I was kind of thinking it was probably sleep apnea. But when he finally went to the sleep study and got it done, really they actually said that he didn't have sleep apnea. Wasn't having enough of those types of apneic episodes to classify him as sleep apnea. What the problem was is that in the 6 hours that he did the sleep study where he was actually sleeping, his brain woke up, like, as in had activity, when it should have been in the resting state, like, 100 times within an hour or something like that. So you think about that.
And like in the sleep cycle, like I don't know if a lot of people know how that works, but usually each sleep cycle is about 90 minutes, and you kind of go through waves, and you
Yep.
go through a wave of really really deep sleep, and then as you're coming out of it, you go into REM sleep, which is like a lot of your processing throughout the night goes to that, where you dream
Mhm.
and that sort of thing, rapid eye movement, and that's when it's a lot lighter of a sleep, um, and he almost you can kind of explain it from there, but like in the way that he woke up, he almost never really went into the deep sleep part of it.
Oh, no. And how would he? Because if his brain was literally waking up 100 times, close to 100 times an hour, he never reached a 90-minute period I mean, like, where was he able to get into that deep sleep? It wasn't
Well,
happening.
and that deep sleep is where your body recharges in general. And so like
That's sleep. That's actual sleep.
so of course with that level of insomnia, he never really he essentially never really slept ever.
No.
Even when he was
Even though
asleep and his body
exactly.
was asleep and you couldn't wake him up, his brain never actually rested. And I'm sure part of
Right.
that was related to anxiety.
Absolutely. Yeah, I 100% am confident that it was related to his anxiety, to the point where then when we had the results of his sleep study, I was just like, "You need to go to a doctor and get on some anti-anxiety meds because clearly this is what's getting in the way of your sleeping." And, you know, and again, you got to remember, like, he was having these episodes and they were getting more frequent, in like 2016, 2017, but especially 2017, like about 8 or 9 months before he died, they just started getting
It was
really,
like
really
it was
bad.
almost like every other day, that he was having
Exactly.
these types of episodes. And like I
And he
said, we didn't.
drove for his job. He
Right.
drove, like, traveled quite extensively.
Well, and so when
And
we
I'm
when
just
we heard
like,
the news that something had happened initially, like on that day that we found out that he died, when we first heard the news, the first thought I think for both of us was like, did he get in a car accident? You know,
hmm
because again, he traveled and he drove, and but like I said before he died, he we didn't find out like the actual answer as to what the sleep issue was until like right before he died. So those that year of where these patterns were getting significantly worse, um we still didn't really know what the problem was, and we kept trying to get him in to go to the doctor to get it figured out, and he still was stubborn about it. He still was
oh, yeah.
saying, we're blowing out of proportion, or we're making it up, or we're it's not that big of a deal.
And they did at the sleep center, like, they did the study, they told him what was going on. They themselves said, "You probably need to be on some sort of anti-anxiety med, and then you also should probably see, like, a sleep therapist," which they
Mm.
kind of work with you to train you how to get into a better sleep pattern, and he just didn't wanna do all of that, So we had answers, but no plan to try to address it, which
Well,
was
and
a
I
little
think
bit frustrating.
I think his mentality from that too was a lot of like, I've gotten this far in life without it, like I don't need it now. And it's like, well,
Mhm.
it's been getting much, much worse though. So you should, this is the point where you do need it, because it's continuing to put you down a bad path. And I think it was kind of a double-edged sword, because that year before he died, we've kind of discussed this. His mental health basically went down the toilet, but also he started having more and more of these episodes where he was
Mhm.
essentially physically displaying his lack of sleep. So
Yeah.
his sleep was getting worse, his mental health was declining, and then
Well, and
go ahead.
let's talk about like the mental health part of it. So not only did we know obviously that he had some sort of anxiety issue, but um he started displaying signs of getting into like a pretty deep depression about a year and a half before he died. But again, I didn't necessarily recognize what it was or what was happening until, probably closer to it probably took about 6 months of him displaying symptoms of being, you know, pretty depressed actually, before it really clicked with me, like, I think he's depressed. Um, and, and you gotta remember that, like, when he was a teenager, he did struggle with some depression, and, there one of the things he shared with me right after we started dating, around the time we got engaged, is that right prior to us starting to date, he was actually suicidal, in that he attempted, at he would have been like 18, 19 years old. And I do think that, that's like I said before, he used to say to me all the time, like, "I think you saved my life. I think I would not be here if it wasn't for us being together." And so I do think, and he never, other than the anxiety, he never had any issues or observable issues, anyways, with like a depression. Not saying that he didn't have depression, he could have, because now we know that there are high functioning people who have depression too, that it can be hard to spot. But he didn't display any overt symptoms of depression throughout our entire marriage. And you got to remember that we'd been together 20 years at the point that he had died. And so that year prior, it took me a hot minute to figure out he's really depressed. Um, because it was very gradual in how it developed. And again, as we mentioned, I was really busy with nursing school. I had some family stuff going on, so there was a year in that the year kind of I would say probably the end of the year where he started to show signs of having depression was the end of I had taken my nephew in who was 15 at the time and essentially was like foster care type thing with him.
Mhm.
And that was its own, challenging experience at the time. So I was in nursing school and I was very distracted with that situation. And so, you know, I think that's about the time when towards the end of that is when he started to develop depression symptoms. But it took me like 6 months after that to really notice that like I think he's severely depressed. And it was to the point where he got so like, I could tell something was wrong, so, like, I think the other kind of misunderstanding that sometimes people have around this stuff is, like, despite outside of, like, talking about mental health specifically or, like, anxiety or any of those things that come with that, he was a very communicative and we had a nice, very close, emotionally connected relationship. And there was a period of time the summer before he died where it was starting to get so bad that I noticed that something was really wrong and I couldn't figure out what was going on with him. Um to the point that like he started to completely emotionally disconnect from me and I could feel that wall that had just all of a sudden come up. And I remember where it didn't matter how much I was trying to figure out what was going on with him, how much I was trying to, open him up to talking to me about it. Cause it's again, it's not like we didn't talk about stuff in our marriage. I mean, we were tight, Um, and all of a sudden he just shut me out. And I remember, around that time I was in school, and just stressed out with my family situation, all this stuff, and I'd put on a little bit of weight, and so I'm starting to think like, is he just like not attracted to me anymore? Like things like his libido started to get lower. Like, again, classic signs of depression. But like all of a sudden he just like was not interested in sex and he wasn't, like, communicating how he felt about it, probably because he didn't know how to articulate it or what to say or how to explain it, but I'm feeling emotionally shut out, and he's all of a sudden not interested in, you know, really having sex or doing anything like that, and I had, gained a little weight, so I'm starting to think, like, is it me? Is he just, like, not attracted? Is it not are we just, what's going on? Is he having an affair? Like, I couldn't figure out what was going on,
But
and I do
he
remember one
also
specific.
I was gonna
Oh, go ahead.
say, he also just started behaving differently in general. Like, I would say it really got noticeable kind of towards the end of that summer. The year before he died, where
Mhm.
even like we had a boat, we enjoyed doing things outside and like together, and even his relationship with me. Granted, I was a teenager, I was really busy between school and work and friends and all that stuff. Like I was kind of at that stage of my life where I was a lot more I would say disconnected from both of you guys. But even I noticed that when I wanted to do things with him, which he normally was very much all for, he was very much he had way less energy and was much less interested in the things that he normally would have loved to go do with me or with anybody else. Well, and mind you, he also around that, a few years prior to that, had kind of lost a lot of his friends um, through various reasons, but he didn't really have any friends. And then again, that he used to have, he used to be very close with a few different people, and then for various reasons he wasn't anymore. And then
And
And
that
he
had
had
nothing to do with him.
no, and he had this kind of social anxiety point where he never really wanted to make friends anymore, and so I think that also, um, potentially contributed in that he had no he never went out and did anything anymore. He had no friends to go do anything with. Even with us, he stopped wanting to do things with us,
He was isolating. I
he was
mean,
he was
very classic
isolating.
signs of depression.
He was isolating not only from the world, but he was isolating from his family in emotional ways and
Mhm.
just even physically. Like he didn't want to hang out with me. He didn't want to hang out with you. He didn't. He was in his own little. He was in his own mental state.
He was clearly suffering with something, and something was up, and we
Something was
just
wrong.
could not figure it out. And there's one thing that really stands out, an experience around that time where, again, I was trying to press him and be like, "What's going on with you? Like, I'm just, I'm worried about you, and we know these things are going on." And I remember, you know, hugging him and just sort of being, because we're laying in bed, and I'm just like, "What's wrong? Like, what's I can tell that something's not right." And he just broke down sobbing, just sobbing. And he was talking about how he hated his life, and he was like, "I feel so bad saying that to you because it doesn't have anything to do with you or Isaac. Like, I adore you, and you guys are the best part of my life, but I absolutely hate my life outside of it, and I'm so unhappy." And he just was so sad, and I've never seen him cry like that. And, you know, again, as the story continues to unfold, it was a little bit of foreshadowing, and it makes sense when we start to figure out what actually was going on. But I was just like so taken aback by the deep level of pain that he was experiencing. And then I wish that at that point he would have felt he could continue to have that discussion with me, and us kind of work together to figure out how to make him feel better. But even though he had that breakdown, he still just shut me out after that. Um,
Well,
and
and
yeah,
he
I mean,
even in terms of what you've talked about that breakdown with me, a few different times, and one of the things that I've gathered from it too, and from what I remember around that time, is he had that breakdown, and so you were very aware that that was kind of the moment that you became very obviously aware that he was super depressed. He was very poignant about the point that he was just unhappy and it had nothing to do with us, but
mhm,
you were trying very hard to help him, and he still was very stubborn about not allowing that, or not doing anything about it for some reason, like he could fix it on his own.
yeah. Yeah, it was a hard space to be in at that time as someone who really loved and cared about him. And that also, again, was when I really started to I was aware of the fact that he was struggling with this stuff, but also like I mentioned in the last episode, I also was so tied up with what I needed to focus on in order to, like, it was like I just need to get this stuff done. And then I knew how stubborn he was, so it was just sort of like, okay, now I know what the issue is. I know what's causing, these challenges between the insomnia and the, you know, severe depression. That was probably the case. And then the fact that he had anxiety. I was like, I knew what was going on at that point. And like I said in the last episode, that's when I sort of said, okay, I'm not going to be able to get him into the doctor at this point because it's going to take a lot of mental energy and effort on my part to convince him to go because he was so stubborn. So I'm going to table this. I know he's not doing well at the moment, but I don't have very long to just finish this out, and then I can solely focus on what's going on with him, and we can address this and fix it. Again, not knowing that that time would never come.
Right, right. And around that time too, besides the sleep issues and those kinds of episodes, and then noticing that he was, more depressed, or very depressed, I should say, and he was also very anxious a lot of the time. He started having some other kind of bizarre behavior that we couldn't quite figure out, and both you and I noticed. I think you noticed before me, but he traveled for work, but he also worked from home a lot, and he worked with paint, like a lot of. He did a lot of like chemistry and paint testing and stuff for his company, and so he had a lot of supplies out in the garage, and it wasn't uncommon for him to go out in the garage quite frequently and do stuff for work. But the amount of times that he was going out into the garage, starting kind of later that summer before he died, was quite frequent. And I think you and I kind of started to pick up on it, and both kind of questioned him at times, like, "What are you doing out there? Why are you going out there all the time?"
It's just and it was such a weird vibe too, like a weird
And he
yeah,
kind of started having like this, like, "Oh, nothing, just work stuff," or like he would kind of shove it off, but you could tell, like, it felt like he was hiding something, and we weren't
yeah.
really sure what. And I remember, later you talking about that. That didn't you say you went out and like actually searched out there at one point because you were suspicious?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's fair to say that like I again was dealing with some family issues where I had, sibling that was in the middle of severe addiction. I, in the back of my mind know that he had, issues with depression when he was a teenager, undiagnosed. Let's clarify that, undiagnosed, but that's probably the case. Um he, he liked to have cocktails and beverages, to unwind at the end of the day. Um, and I wasn't naive to the fact that like his behavior seemed to me to be very kind of secretive and it was weird. And I was like, is he using something and is he hiding it? And so there were times where I would like try to sneak out there, and I swear to God, that guy had, like, super hearing because he would be at like, we had this tandem garage, so, like, where there was, like, a workshop, and that's where the boat was parked, and he always was there in this, like, same area, and it didn't matter how quiet I was to sneak out after him. Literally, like, I'd go around the corner and he'd just be like, "Whatever," and it was just always weird, and I'd be like, "What are you doing?" And he always had some sort of thing that he was, like, working on doing, but it just I knew something was off, and it didn't make sense to me, and
Spidey
so
senses were tingling, like this, something he's doing is not what he says it is,
he yeah, I could tell I felt like he was hiding something, and, yeah, so there were a couple times because I always would find him kind of in that area of the garage. I went and started looking through the garage being like, "Okay, I'm not dumb. Like I know how this works," and trying to figure out what is it that he has out here because I was concerned that there was something going on. Now, I'll, you know, say even though we're not to that part yet that when we did figure out what was going on, I it was not expecting what it actually was.
Well,
Um
and on that point, I would
and
say, okay, continue, sure.
Oh, I was just gonna say too, um, we can get into that the next episode actually. So
Yeah. And on that point, I think all of this really came to a head when we figured out exactly what was going on with him. Beyond there was, because obviously there was more than just the depression and the anxiety. There was more than just the sleep issues and the strange behavior. Um, and it all kind of came to a head one night when you had gone to bed, and I had my area down in the basement, but my room was upstairs, and so I was getting ready
your
for
little
bed.
man cave.
Yeah, and I came upstairs, and Dad was like sitting on the couch watching a movie or something, watching TV. I don't remember exactly what, but I went to go say goodnight to
I was
him.
sleeping.
Yeah, I went to go say goodnight to him, and uh, he was in one of those episodes again where he was slurring his words and extra tired and just kind of like off. Something was off. And I was trying to have a conversation with him. And, you know, at this point, these episodes had become so frequent that I was like, even I was frustrated with it, where I was annoyed that he was not doing anything to solve this issue because it was an issue that had become so prevalent in our family, that it was almost every night at this point that he was in this state where I was like, "Go to bed. You're tired.
Mhm.
You're really annoying, or you're being irritable, or whatever." And so I confronted him, and
And
I was like, "Listen,
and s well, just a side note too, I mean, you gotta remember, you have a lot more understanding now at 23 about a lot of these things like depression, anxiety. You've worked in the ER. Um, you've obviously been through something super traumatic, etc. But you didn't have that exposure prior to that, like really a ton. And so you didn't really even the stuff that I knew that was going on behind the scenes, like the fact that I think he was really depressed and like the anxiety was probably worse than he had. And something was off and like I had suspicions about what it might be.
I knew
It's not like I
something
was sharing it's not
was
like I was
off, but
sharing
I wasn't as in tune with it as you were, and like I also was very disconnected because I was very involved in my own stuff that I had
yeah.
going on as a teenager should be. So like I knew something was wrong with him. I knew that he was acting differently and he was having more of these
Yeah.
episodes, and I knew that you know he was having some sort of issue, but I wasn't really that privy to it.
Yeah, and I wasn't sharing it with you on purpose because again, you're a kid. It's not your job to know all of the problems that might be going on, whether it was like in our relationship or, that he's struggling with something that we're trying to figure out. Like that was not it wasn't an issue that you needed to know about, right? So
Right.
you also had no reason to even suspect any of these things.
Yeah, I had none of the background knowledge other than I knew that he had some sort of sleep issue, and I knew he had these episodes, and I knew he had like some weird behavior, and that and that was about it. That's all I noticed. But the sleep issues were becoming so prevalent that I was getting really annoyed with him when he was in those episodes because at that, when he was acting like that, he wasn't my dad. He didn't act like the Eric that I knew. He didn't
Mm-mm.
act like the dad that I knew. And he was basically a completely different person when he would enter those quote unquote sleep episodes. Um and so I confronted him and I was like, cuz at this point he still was refusing to get checked out with it. And I said, I remember sitting down and talking to him and being very upfront with him and saying like, you know, I you're tired again. You're having one of these episodes, and I know you think that we're making this up, but we're not. And it is affecting our family, when you have these episodes and they're becoming more frequent and something is wrong. And I literally told him, "You are not my dad when you act like this. When you have these episodes, you don't act like my dad. You are a completely different person. I need you. I'm asking you to go get checked out so we can fix this or we can do something about it because something's wrong and it keeps happening and it's getting more frequent and I can't put up with you when you're in this state because you either get irritable and get on everybody's case or you get really annoying or you're not my dad when you're like this." And he kept saying like, "No, I can fix it, like it's not that big of a deal. I know what's going on." And I was like, what do you mean you can fix it? Like you don't even know what's going on. You refuse to go to the doctor. You refuse to
Mhm.
get a sleep study or to figure out what this is. And in my brain I'm still thinking that most of this is related or all of this is related to his sleep. And he kept telling me like, "No, I can fix it. I know what's happening." And I was like, "If you know what's going on, then what is it? Like tell me." And he took a moment and he took a big sigh and I sat on the floor and he said, I drink a lot.
Hey, you know how this works.
If you like this episode or just like us in general, you can find us at It's Going Podcast on all the things.
Don't forget to check out the links in the description.
And thanks for hanging out with us.